Tonight on Free Thinking, we have a yen for Zen and a thirst for the Tripitaka, as we explore how Buddhism has shaped the modern world. When the Gautama Siddhartha sat under a tree in India some 2,500 years ago and experienced sudden enlightenment, he never guessed how far his ideas would spread. For the last half-century in the West, Zen Buddhism has been associated with meditation, mellowness, and motorcycle maintenance. In more recent years, more and more people have been busting stress with a session of Buddhist-inspired mindfulness. But are we right to see Buddhism purely as an introspective religion of peace and enlightenment? Does nirvana have a dark side? We'll be discussing key research on whether Buddhism was a factor in Japan's path towards the Second World War, and we'll ask whether Buddhism and irrationality have a special relationship. To get us all a little bit further towards the Four Noble Truths, I'm delighted to say that I have with me four noble experts. Rupert Gethin is Professor of Buddhist Studies at Bristol University. Mark Vernon is a former priest and therapist involved in guiding the parliamentary group on mindfulness. Annemet Fisker-Nielsen of SOAS is a specialist on Japanese religion and society, and Christopher Harding teaches Asian history at Edinburgh University and is a Radio 3 New Generation thinker. So let's start with mindfulness. Now, in recent years, this meditation technique seems to have taken our stressed-out nation by storm. Admittedly, a very gentle and chillaxed storm. You only have to step into a village hall or community centre to find a session going on. Mindfulness even has its own all-party group in Parliament. The term is a translation of the word shruti in the classical Indian language Pali, and it's associated in particular with the Theravada tradition of Buddhism dominant in Southeast Asia. Now, Mark Vernon, I mentioned that you're helping to bring mindfulness to Parliament. Why do our members of Parliament, our MPs, need to draw on Southeast Asian Buddhist techniques?
I think that the parliamentary interest is partly because of the explosion of interest in mindfulness and the way that it's been practiced in all sorts of ways. It's come out of a kind of medical model, the 8-week course developed first in the US and brought into this country now for primarily therapeutic use. And so the parliamentary inquiry is to try and see kind of what's happening, get a sense of what's happening, and maybe to try and develop some kind of guidelines as to how this spreads.
Just explain, because the NHS is also, I think, drawing on this too. What are the claims that are actually being made for the usefulness of mindfulness?
Well, the claims can be very broad, but the evidence doesn't go quite as broad as sometimes the claims that are made for it. It does seem, for example, that mindfulness as a therapy has great efficacy in chronic conditions. So, for example, if you have a repeating depression, the mindfulness technique can help prevent the repeats, and that kind of evidence is very strong.
And you yourself, I think, are a practitioner of mindfulness. I mean, could you just very briefly take us through what it is you actually do? How does it work for you?
Yeah, I mean, there is debate about how to define mindfulness too. I kind of like a minimalist debate, which a minimalist definition, which defines it as essentially a process of learning to not be quite so entangled with your humdrum
So
thoughts.
tell us what you do, actually, Mark. I mean, when you're sitting there, presumably quietly, what actually goes through your mind?
You try to observe what's going on. And you use a still posture in order to try and encourage the mind to still. I think that people do talk about blissful experiences or stilling the mind. My experience more is that it's not so much that your mind stops, which I don't really think happens, but it's that you're able to take a kind of half a step back and so not be quite so identified with what's going on in your mind. And actually, even a half step back can be really quite liberating in terms of not being so swept along by, particularly if you have some kind of mental health problem and by the trouble that can cause.
Well, I noted there you used the word liberation, and I think, or liberating, and I'm going to want to come back to that in just a little bit to find out what it is that mindfulness actually does for us. But Rupert Gethin, there's a historical origin to this, isn't there? And I mentioned that it's actually in Burma, and I think in the late 19th century, that what we think of today as mindfulness emerges first.
Yes, I think that's right, that the immediate roots of modern mindfulness go back to the late 19th century and early 20th century in Burma, where there were a group of monks, Lady Sayadaw, then Mahasi Sayadaw, and then other teachers like U Ba Khin, who were interested in modernizing Buddhism and Buddhist meditation and bringing it into the modern world, specifically for a Burmese population. And they were interested in trying to get the Burmese laity to meditate and practice meditation, because traditionally meditation is really more the preserve of Buddhist monks. And
so it was something that sort of democratized Buddhism in a sense.
Yes. I mean, I think it's important also to see that there are different types of Buddhist meditation. I mean, for example, there's traditionally a kind of calm meditation, which involves concentrating fully on a particular object and then attaining something like samadhi, deep absorption. And it was kind of felt that that type of meditation was not so appropriate for the laity, people living an ordinary life and working, and that mindfulness meditation, insight meditation as it's sometimes called as well, was more appropriate and could be adapted and used by people in everyday life. And that kind of meditation was then began to become popular in Burma and was taken up by monks. Well, I was thinking of a figure like Nyanaponika, a German Buddhist monk who was in Sri Lanka. He wrote a book. He practiced this form of meditation with Mahasi Sayadaw, and then wrote a book called The Heart of Buddhist Meditation, which had a great influence out, in the Western world, among Western Buddhists.
And there are figures like Henry Olcott in Sri Lanka as well, who become very much involved as Westerners with that Buddhist movement at the time. I mean, it seems to be in some ways tied up with anti-colonialism as well, doesn't it? The idea that there's something culturally indigenous that can be used to try and instill almost a nationalist feeling in people at that time.
In Sri Lanka, there was part of that. I mean, I think also there were certain Western admirers of Buddhism, and they admired Buddhism for particular things they saw in Buddhism, particularly the kind of Buddhism you get in Sri Lanka, where the Buddha was depicted as a sort of as an ethical teacher who was against sort of blind faith and trust in God and rituals. And there were certain Western admirers of that. And then the Sri Lankan Buddhists, to some extent, when they saw that that was what Westerners admired, then deliberately emphasized that aspect of Buddhism.
Well, I suppose the independence thing was in my mind because of the word liberation that Mark used, but I want to put something else to you, Rupert, which is, in some ways, either independence politically or liberation personally seems a bit odd in terms of thinking of some of the core philosophical ideas that you might associate with Buddhism, because it's the idea of impermanence, the idea of sorrow as central to life, the destruction of the self. These don't sound like terribly liberating ideas for many people.
Right. Well, I think what traditional Buddhism would say is that we are trapped in a world of our making, which we make through conceptual thought and through not seeing things as they are. And the way things are, according to Buddhism, is impermanent, not so much sorrow, I would say unsatisfactory, and then they're not yours, they're not self.
But it's still not sort of self-realization and liberation in the sense of sort of achieving, happiness in that rather Western idea.
Well, yes and no. I mean, I think what Buddhism would say is that because we fail to see the way the world is, it's not just an intellectual problem. We emotionally invest in the way we think the world is, and it's not like that. Everything we think we own and possess is going to come to an end. We can't hold on to any of it.
Impermanence is central to the idea.
And so the only way, so we're actually trapped, we're not free, and the only way to make ourselves free is therefore let go of it all. Now that sounds frightening, but Buddhism claims that actually, although that's the last thing at some level we want to do, Buddhism would argue that actually letting go of everything is a liberation. It seems like a nothing, but it's actually a good thing, and that will bring us a sort of ultimate happiness.
Mark Vernon, I mentioned you're a former priest, you come from a Christian background. Do you think that mindfulness can be made meaningful without its Buddhist religious carapace?
I think so, yeah, because if it's just a sort of technique, then quite where it leads you is going to depend upon the metaphysics that you bring to the investigation.
And what do you bring to it? I mean, presumably you wouldn't call yourself a Buddhist, or would you?
Sort of Christo-Buddhist, whatever, kind of combo.
That sounds effortlessly multicultural. I don't know if it actually exists or not.
To put it a bit more specifically, it does fit for me with a theistic framework because, Ruby just mentioned there the letting go.
But does Buddhism fit with a theistic framework? I mean, famously, some people say it's an atheistic religion.
Well, there's Buddhisms, of course, aren't there? And I think some do quite easily, actually. In fact, figures like the Dalai Lama, Thich Nhat Hanh, these great figures that have come into the West, they talk quite easily about God. God. You might want to ask quite what they mean by that, but nonetheless they use that kind of language. But for me, this letting go is often associated in Buddhism with the discovery of a kind of bigger mind, perhaps, or infinite compassion. It's not just letting go into nothing in a straightforwardly nihilistic sense. And that then fits to me with traditions in Christianity that too, I think, practice contemplation, that have got rather lost since the Reformation in the West, but nonetheless, I think can be brought together.
But nonetheless, Rupert, do you think it's possible or even sensible to separate mindfulness from the fact that it does have this strong Buddhist religious background? I mean, not just the specific philosophy, but the institutions, rituals, iconography, what in the Catholic tradition you might call the smells and the bells.
Yeah, right. Well, clearly if mindfulness outside the Buddhist context helps people, what's to criticize? But I think that sometimes there can be problems. Clearly, if you focus on the world as impermanent, suffering, not self, and look at those things, and the idea is that you just watch this flow of physical and mental phenomena, let go of them, you might see your ordinary self, all that you thought was permanent and solid, kind of evaporate. And that can be, I guess, frightening and scary. Now, in a Buddhist context, I mean, it's a kind of good thing. Ultimately, you are meant to let go, but you might misinterpret it, as it were. You might think that, well, what I need to do is kind of blot myself out in some way. So traditional Buddhist practices like rituals, prostrating in front of a Buddha, the Buddhist symbols, the ethical framework, and so forth, all the Buddhist narrative, all that gives the practitioner a kind of assurance, a support that this is a kind of safe practice. It creates a sort of safe space in which to do this practice. And the danger sometimes is perhaps, or the danger I might see is that if you strip away that, you're left with a rather emotionless practice.
I mean, you asked about what the problem might be with using a version of mindfulness with the Buddhism taken out. And I might throw this back to you, Mark, because you come more directly perhaps from that Christian tradition. Isn't the danger that concentrating on the self makes you self-ish? Because mindfulness is essentially inwardly directed, it doesn't provide a very good sort of forcing ground for the outward-looking values, the kind of things you talk about like compassion.
Well, you're highlighting why it's easily said and quite difficult to do, because there are endless hurdles on the way. You talk about, and the problem, I think, when Buddhism comes into the West and uses words like the self, which of course means something very different from how it's been used traditionally in Buddhist countries. I think there are other problems. With the psychotherapeutic hat on, you might worry that people try to create a sort of psychic retreat, as it's sometimes called, a sort of safe space that is sort of free of all their problems, which they use the mindfulness practice to try and create. But of course that's going to force things apart. It's going to cause splits in themselves, and that's likely to come undone at some point. So there are many problems and difficulties, I think, which are going to be encountered on the way when you undergo some kind of mindfulness training.
I have a slightly more technical question to ask you, actually, Rupert, which is that you're an academic who works on Buddhism, but you're also a practitioner. And I wonder slightly if one informs the other, the way that, say, a classical music critic going to hear an orchestra sometimes hears, the strings muffing their entry in a way that someone who's more amateur would just sit there and enjoy it. I mean, do you find yourself seeing people using these Buddhist-derived techniques and going, oh, dear, no, that's not quite right?
Well, as I said before, I think if it helps people...
that sounds like yes to me.
Well, I suppose it's an element. I think it's more this problem of certain dangers inherent in it. And I think it also sometimes undervalues certain resources in the Buddhist tradition. I suppose one of the things I think is a problem with the modern craze for mindfulness is that mindfulness is kind of put on this pedestal and abstracted from a rather more complex picture of meditation and practices, which exists, I think, in Buddhism. And it's part and part of a kind of with some, a kind of move to kind of remove what's seen as the cultural baggage of Buddhism, unreasonable, irrational ideas like rebirth and so forth. Let's just get down to the essentials. Now with the help of modern medicine, clinical trials, neuroscience, we can identify what really works here and abstract that essential aspect of Buddhism and do away with the rest. And I think there are kind of resources. I mean, these aren't exclusive to Buddhism, but Buddhist myth, narrative, and so forth, that can support the practice and help it. And there's a danger of diminishing, I suppose, the richness of things.
I mean, I think part of the richness can return perhaps by the dialogue between Buddhism and psychotherapy, because it helps to understand the inner life and the workings of the inner life in a way that the stripped down kind of sheer practice, you might say, can lose touch with. And that's happening very much in the West. People trying to bring the two worlds together. And that can actually bring back some of the Buddhist mythology, the different realms of the inner world and things like this, and give them a sort of psychotherapeutic language around concepts like narcissism that can help, actually I think, help the myth stand up on its own as well as inform it for the Western mind.
So a genuine cross-cultural dialogue of ideas, in other words. This is BBC Radio 3. I'm Rana Mitter, and you're listening to Free Thinking. And don't forget that you can download hundreds of our previous shows from our website, which is definitely a source of pure enlightenment. And our topic today is Buddhism and its influence on shaping the modern world, with my guests Rupert Gethin, Christopher Harding, Annemette Fisker-Nielsen and Mark Vernon. And I want to move our focus along now. We'll move on from mindfulness, which was based on the Theravada school of Buddhism, dominant in Southeast Asia, and on to an aspect of the Mahayana school, popular in East Asia, and in Japan in particular. And Japan is the originary point of Zen, the type of Buddhism that's proved consistently most fascinating to Westerners. A doctrine of sudden enlightenment which delights in paradox and seeming irrationality. So it throws up phrases such as, if you see the Buddha, you must kill the Buddha. But in case all this seems rather obscure or remote, then it's worth remembering that Japanese Buddhism was at the heart of one of the most important stories in recent world history, the rise to power of modern Japan in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and the path to World War II. Now, in recent years, historians have argued that there was a close relationship between the ideology of Japanese nationalism and certain strands in Japanese Buddhist thought and practice. And Annemette Fisker-Nielsen, we associate some of the most prominent strands of Buddhism, Zen and also Nichiren, with Japan. But actually, Buddhism was nearly suppressed when Japan began to modernise in the late 19th century, wasn't it?
Yes, that's right. I mean, at the turn of when the Meiji era comes in 1868, or Meiji Restoration, rather, there is certainly the sort of the beginning years of those. There's a process in which there's trying to suppress the Buddhist organisations and institutions.
Would you say the Meiji Restoration was the period when Japan sort of had to open up to the outside world and modernised itself at great speed?
Basically, I mean, yes, and it was a process that was taking place quite, at least a decade and more before then, in which that involved the various sort of flourishing of various different kinds of schools of thoughts, including Buddhist schools of thoughts, including the sort of national learning sorts of schools of thought, and various different sort of civil societies that arose at that particular point in time, that also engaged in sort of more similar to sort of Western types of civil societies, in which that sort of engaged in discussing agricultural reform and various different kinds of modern types of reform, frugality, economies and so on, and various different kinds. So when the Meiji Restoration happened, there was an attempt, because that was the sort of restoration of the emperor at the centre of the political system.
So in other words, a real sort of modernisation of the whole system, making it constitution, army, education, all changed in a big way, and religion as part of that. But Chris Harding, Zen, Nichiren and these other strands of Japanese Buddhism have, of course, a much longer history in Japan itself. They don't emerge in the 19th century.
I think the relationship of Buddhism with the state in Japan is very important, because when you get to the 19th century, Buddhism is scrabbling to demonstrate its relevance to the modern state, but Buddhist sects have been doing that for 1,000 years or more by this point. So, for example, when you get the first Zen sects appearing in Japan as they do in the 12th and 13th centuries, one of the first things you have to do is establish some political backing. Where are you going to get your money for temples? Who's going to keep you secure?
And this is in a sort of feudal medieval time when basically samurais and warlords are basically fighting each other for control of Japan. It's not a peaceful society.
It's not peaceful. I suppose one of the things that Zen offers, and it's not just Zen, but I mean particularly Zen becomes known for this. I suppose two things in particular. One is that you can, within the Mahayana tradition, you can, by the performance of certain rituals, even through meditation actually, generate a certain amount of merit. Monks doing these things can generate merit which can be then transferred to the state, a way of protecting the state. And also, to a certain extent, there's Zen training for samurai as a way of making them more effective and efficient on the battlefield, although that becomes exaggerated in the modern era, when they kind of look back and recreate Zen.
And they create the idea of Bushido, the way of the warrior, as something that was actually part of the Japanese tradition. But of course, warriors and the military are absolutely central to modernisation in the late 19th and early 20th century, Annamet. And one of the things that one notes is that when recruits were conscripted into the Japanese army during that early 20th century period, they were often inducted using Buddhist language, and the army called itself the Chuo, the centre of society, and referred to the secular world, the whole of the rest of Japan, as the Chiho, the provinces. And this is a direct lift from the language you use about entering a Buddhist monastery.
Yes, and I mean, in a sense, the Zen language was very much used in terms of selflessness as being an obedience to the state and sort of the way in which Zen, the selflessness of Zen soldiers or practices, Bushido, was to give yourself for the nation in itself. And there was even comparisons to sort of types of Buddhist compassion with giving yourself for the nation. And that was seen, and of course that was very much constructed within a language of social evolutionism at the time that had taken roots in Japan at the time and in previous times, with the construction of this new nation state that was very much centered on this emperor ideology at the center, and the emperor itself sort of sacralizing and sanctifying and imbuing the whole nation with morality as such. And so that Zen in particular, but of course also strands of Nichiren, under particularly a guy called Chikaku Tanaka, takes on this idea of that, in a sense, could be interpreted from Nichiren teachings of, because he does talk about the nation, but it's very much pulling together this idea that the law of the nation, if you like, the law of the sovereign, is superior to the law of the Buddha. And so it's these kind of ideas that go back in a long time,
So a sort of
Buddhist
political
history.
Buddhism to do with nationalism at that time. But Chris, I know you're a specialist on India as well as on Japan, and I'm wondering at the same time, is there a sense of a sort of, well, at the time the term Pan-Asianism was often used to try and find spiritual links between different societies. So we've been talking about Japan, but does this same period see any links with what's happening in somewhere like India as well?
I think so. I think a couple of things there. One is that when Buddhist organisations in the 1980s and 90s started apologising for the role that they'd played during the Second World War, one of the things they said was that they had encouraged this process of seeing Buddhism as central to Asian culture, and therefore Buddhist missionary activity could be a way of getting peoples in China, Taiwan, Southeast Asia
Now,
to
let's
feel
stop there for a
happier.
moment, because actually one of the things that we associate with the 19th century, most Western historians, is Christian missionaries going from place to place. But you're saying there's a Buddhist trend for this at this time as well.
I think absolutely. The Christian missionaries were hugely influential on how Buddhist organisations thought they should act. So they said a serious religious organisation in the late 19th century has to have missionaries, has to have clear sacred texts, it has to do social work, it has to run schools. Buddhists are doing all these sorts of things because they realised that, especially in the late 19th century, they're really battling for the survival of Buddhism. You've got tens of thousands of temples closing. I think, how can we demonstrate our relevance to the state, and how can we get the next generation to retain an interest in Buddhism? And a lot of what they do is really centred around not dying out in Japan, which at least at one point seems like a real likelihood.
Yeah, that's right. So I think also someone like Junichi Sumae, for instance, demonstrates the way in which the concept itself of religion enters Japan very much at a time when Japan is confronted with international Christendom that's coming in, and very much with those sort of colonializing forces. So it's presented with the word religion, and then becomes translated as shukyo, right, in Japanese. But it's very much this sort of abstract concept of religion is at first sort of a big puzzlement. What does it actually mean? And so But it becomes very much reified, in a sense, as something that a civilized nation has, because, of course, this is a time in which Japan is classified as a barbarian or sort of lower class, not
and
quite
Japan
civilized
shows its end to civilization by following the forms almost of
by
Christianity.
adding on the notion that it has religion. And so, of course, when the Meiji Restoration happens, it is indeed that religion, as Buddhist institutions face their own persecutions, are then vying with each other to
Chris,
take on religion.
I think that's right. I think there are some fairly spectacular intellectual gymnastics that go on. People like Inoue Enryo, a Buddhist priest who gets rid of his robes, becomes a philosopher, and he manages, on the one hand, to say that Buddhism is both in line with scientific method and scientific findings, yet also transcends it. There are elements of Christianity that resonate with Buddhism, and yet Buddhism transcends it. And most importantly, Japanese Buddhism is kind of the ultimate development of Buddhism around the world, surpassing India, Thailand, and all the rest of it.
All right, well, Chris, I need to ask you now a more controversial question, which picks up on something you just said a couple of minutes ago. And you said that back in the 1980s and 90s, 30 years ago, some Japanese Buddhist groups were apologising for their role in the lead-up to World War II in Japanese society. And the question is, did the form of Buddhism that emerged in Japan in the early 20th century, in the time that we're talking about, inevitably lead on the path to war? Should we blame Buddhism?
I would probably rather say that Buddhist organisations got caught up in a militarist move.
I'm sure that's what they'd say as well. But is that fair?
I think it'd probably be fair. I mean, the first people to apologise after the war, the first religious organisation to apologise weren't the Buddhists, but the Christians. United Church of Christ in Japan in the late 1960s had to apologise because they'd been caught up in the same sort of mood. That said, there are specific things that various Buddhist groups do. You have, for example, officers being sent to train zazen using army blankets as cushions. You have really quite ugly rhetoric about how it can be the most compassionate thing to launch a war and to kill if in the greater interests of those people.
And the irony that the first country that Japan invades is China, where, of course, there are lots of other Buddhists who they're fighting.
Absolutely, and there's an awful irony that the general who led the attack on Nanking, we now know as the rape of Nanking, later tried to reinvent the Bodhisattva of compassion canon as basically a god of war. There's a temple built to canon in Japan which used the blood-stained earth of Chinese battlefields to build a statue of canon.
And if I remember rightly, was then hanged for war crimes afterwards.
Quite rightly, and yes, he was.
Oh gosh, well, there's a statement you don't necessarily hear from an academic, a liberal academic, very often. But Anna-Mette, can I put the same question to you? Should we blame the Buddhism of the early 20th century, on which you're pretty expert, for the path to war?
Well, I don't know if I'll call myself an expert on that particular area, but certainly perhaps more related to politics. But I think no, in a sense, unless you want to blame the sort of... I mean, you see an interesting phenomena in that you have a very flourishing society, a pluralistic society, flourishing of civil society. You have a huge media, national media, huge amount, thousands of different kinds of publications. You have a public sphere that's debating all sorts of different issues, not necessarily very critical of the state as such, but certainly debating...
But let me put something specific to you, though, Anna-Mette. I mean, state Shinto, the official Japanese state religion, as it was put forward, was essentially banned by the Americans after World War II because it was blamed for being part of the nexus that led to the outbreak of war with China and then the United States. Is it fair to absolve Buddhism from being part of that nexus of religious power?
No, I don't think it's fair to absolve them of responsibility at all, because they were very instrumental institutions in drumming up support for the war, together with the mass media, together with various different women's groups, neighbourhood groups and so on, the various sort of different layers of civil society. And they were instrumental, in a sense, in implementing the state directives on a communal, local level and so on. So
I think it's worth adding that there were radical young Buddhists like Senno Gido who did try to launch critiques in the early 30s.
So Buddhist resistors as well.
Exactly that. They were saying, proper Buddhists would be, in the early 30s, would be criticising Hitler for the repression of the Jews. They wouldn't let this corrupt bourgeois Buddhism carry on that's currently existing. Where does he find himself? He's in prison for much of the war as a result of that.
Let me bring up another thinker briefly, Chris, because one thing that fascinates me, July 1942, Pearl Harbor has happened, Japan is at war with America and with China, and what happens at the elite level? They bring in 13 top philosophers, every academic's dream, I think, to discuss what's going to happen next. And the theme of that conference in Japan is phrased as overcoming modernity. Now, I think that's a very interesting statement, because I can't imagine, let's say, Chinese political thinkers or, American political thinkers at that point seeking to overcome modernity in the middle of a war. And philosophers like Nishida Kitaro, one of the great philosophers of 20th century Japan and someone who knew his Buddhism extremely well, was absolutely central to that. What was going on there?
I think we're putting our fingers on another group of people who had questions to answer after 1945, which is the Kyoto School of philosophers, partly rooted in Zen Buddhism. Nishida Kitaro was famously a practitioner of Zen. And the way that, I suppose, the Kyoto philosophers, like some Buddhists, made kind of grand metaphysical statements that were at best very, very open to misappropriation by the authorities. So, for example, the Kyoto school talk about absolute nothingness as a kind of godhead. And they say, how does this absolute nothingness interact with the world that we live in? It's not via the individual or via meditation. It's via the state, the nation, in particularly Japan. And if you die,
so it's an excuse essentially for state power and violent state power.
Well, no, I mean, I think before the war, the discussion of something like absolute nothingness is more subtle. But by the middle of the war, you got philosophers saying that the most perfect symbol of absolute nothingness in this world is the Japanese nation, and to die in the service of the Japanese nation is the most perfect thing imaginable. And there are students, there are young soldiers listening to lectures, reading books, and they're very much influenced by that. You can see from their diaries.
Yes, I mean, I would just also like to bring up another example of resistance, if you like, as in complements the one that you just mentioned. And that is particularly Sunasa Buddha Makuguchi, who then becomes, and together with Yosei Toda, who become the founders of, at that time called Sokokyoiku Gakkai, but Soka Gakkai, which then goes on, of course, after the world to become the in many ways a very successful.
So two contrasting examples there, one from Chris, one from Anna-Mess, and I'm going to throw the last question in this part to you, Rupert. Can we therefore say that Buddhism is just as capable of engendering either peaceful or violent reaction as any other religion? In other words, that Buddhism is no more or less a religion of peace or calm or meditation or of violence than any other religion?
I think I'd probably prefer to say that Buddhists are just as capable of being violent as anybody else.
But they get their ideas from an intellectual tradition that comes from
They do.
as do Christians or Muslims.
But I think it's how those ideas get used. I mean, clearly there's a very strong tradition, doctrinal tradition within Buddhism, which is categorically against violence, and will say, that killing any creature, human being or whatever, is in some sense an act of bad karma. It's a bad act. It will lead to unpleasant results, and that's very clear doctrinally. But I guess what happens a little bit in Buddhism is that there is then a kind of hierarchy or a move which says, well, we're all going to commit bad actions. Some bad actions are worse than others. Sometimes committing bad actions becomes justified. There's a very famous story of the Bodhisattva in Indian Mahayana Buddhism. There's this idea of skill in means that comes up. So in order to protect 500 people, the Bodhisattva decides that he must kill someone else because this person is about to kill these others. So he kills them. He knows it's a bad act, but he does it as a kind of expedient. And because he knows it's a bad act and he agrees to take on the bad action, the results of the bad action, there's a kind of cop-out in the story because, in fact, in the end, he doesn't receive the results, even though he's willing to do this bad act. So there are devices within Buddhism that can justify that.
Clearly enable them to say that. And Rupert, when you said bad karma, I was tempted to say bad karma man, because enabling me to do that lets me bring our story up to date.
Right.
And it reminds us that our own Western ideas about Buddhism and Zen in particular have been shaped by the spread of its more anti-rationalist ideas into the Western world. And famously, Allen Ginsberg, the Beat poets, they all drew on it as they were hanging out in California and elsewhere, inspired by Zen teachings about finding enlightenment suddenly, in the everyday, without relying on some complicated doctrine or philosophy. And they were also, of course, influenced by the apparently paradoxical, riddling style of some of the Zen writings. But before we get into that, Chris, we do need to understand that Buddhism and rational modernity really did come to terms with each other in the 20th century, didn't they?
I think so. Bizarrely, before you get to the beats and the counterculture, one of the attractions of Buddhism for people in the West is that it seems to offer a combination of two things. One is that it's in tune with rational modernity, and the other is that it offers seems to offer an experiential dimension to life. So initially it's the rationalism, the rationality of Buddhism that really seems to attract people. So really from the late 19th century onwards, people in the West are saying if there is one truly scientific religion, then it's Buddhism. The Japanese...
Could you give us an example? I mean, what is it that makes people say that about Buddhism in particular, that's particularly rational?
I think there are certain parts of Buddhist doctrine that you can draw on as being in tune, certainly in a crude sense, with modern science. Things like the laws of cause and effect. That's one that often gets brought in. Also, what you have is a process of what they call demythologization, where anything inconvenient to modernity is relegated to the role of being a myth, often particularly a psychological form. To go back to something that Mark was saying earlier on, so hungry ghosts, bodhisattvas, etc. These can be repressed emotions. These can be aspects of our personality, for better or for worse, etc. Once you've been through that kind of modern clean-up of Buddhism, it ends up looking or can be presented as something that's thoroughly rational and unproblematic.
I mean, I think it also has to do with the way Buddhism came west. I mean, Buddhisms came west at different times. So in the late 19th century, early 20th century, there was a particular fascination with the Pali texts, which seemed to be able to be read as presenting the true original teachings of the Buddha in some way. And then the Buddha, there was this idea that you could get access to the Buddha as a real flesh and blood teacher, and that later Buddhist ideas were a kind of a corruption of a pure rationalistic original teaching of the Buddha.
And I guess also there's a reaction against Christianity going on. So Alan Watts, you mentioned there, was a Christian priest, and a move away from a kind of proof of God sort of rationality to a kind of philosophical shock rationality that's going to release something else about reality. So different kinds of rationality going on, you might say.
Yes, I was just, different kinds of rationality that's going on, I think, as well. And of course, if we draw on people like Talal Asad, who shows how secularism in the West needs to be understood as a project that grew out of a particular historical condition of Christian monotheism in the early modern period and so on. So we see that also how the religious articulation of the modern state are visible most poignantly in the states gaining what is seen as legitimate control of life and death, in a sense. So states in waging war and of course carry out executions and so on have always had a sort of sovereign right over lives of the subjects, but unique to the modern state is that it sort of assumes direct responsibility for supplying this sort of compensatory meaning that is applied to sending soldiers out to war, fight for the nation and so on. So in a sense, the meaning of death becomes part of public policy, if you like, of integration to the state. So in a sense, I just want to think about, how do we think about rationality as such? And of course, I think integral to Buddhism, I suppose, has been that law of cause and effect, and moving away from this idea of believing in a God.
I want to move us just a little bit, if I may, for our last few minutes onto irrationality, because that's something that's also very much associated with this tradition. And Rupert, again, as a specialist in Buddhism, I wonder if you slightly sort of groan and curse the way in which the beat Zen of the 1950s, the kind of Allen Ginsberg side of things, has shaped popular understanding of what it is.
Well, I think actually there is a very long history of, if you like, suspicion of rationality in Buddhism. So, according to tradition, immediately after the Buddha had attained enlightenment, he reflected on what he had discovered, and he said that it's beyond the realm, beyond the sphere of rational thinking, in effect. So there's a long tradition of saying that reason or rationality can't of itself bring you to liberation, and that's where.
So Allen Ginsberg wasn't wrong in that sense.
Not, I think within traditional Buddhism, or I should say within Indian Buddhism, I think the approach is more that you can use reason up to a certain point. So Buddhism will use arguments that are very similar to David Hume's to argue against the existence of a permanent, substantial self and so forth. So you can use reason for certain Buddhist doctrines, but reason of itself can't get you to this insight, this liberating insight. There has to be this direct experiential part, and that's in all Buddhism, I would say.
I'm wondering that, Annamet, in our present-day world, where actually, in a sense, reason has come under question for a whole variety of reasons, where we live perhaps in a postmodern rather than a modern rationalist world, in many people's understanding. Is there such a thing as postmodern Buddhism, do you think? Discuss.
That's a rather interesting question. Well, I think, in a sense, if you go back to Nichiren and look at the way, you could, in a sense, say that he had a very rational approach to it and tried to make...
This is Nichiren, the founder
Nichiren,
of that.
the founder in the 13th century, that's right. So his focus was on the 3,000 realm of the movements of existence, which was a particular theoretical concept of how the individual relates, their inner state, their intention, their life state relates to the outer world. That is, of course, developed in the 6th century in China. That comes out of that. So, wherever it goes back to in terms of Buddhism. But it's a very rationalist approach in terms of how do you engage with the social world.
Now, I'm not going to let you two get away with this, because you've given this fantastically erudite explanation of how there's this long tradition in Zen and in Nichiren which reaches right up to the present day, and that there's nothing that needs to sort of violate our sense of a continuity intellectually. But Mark, I'm going to turn to you. Surely there is a reason that the counterculture, the Allen Ginsberg Beat generation, turned to that type of Zen. It wasn't because they wanted to find an intellectual continuity with Japan and China of the past. It was because that they embraced something they saw there that ran at right angles to the mainstream culture of the time, surely.
Yeah, I mean, this is not an academic answer, but my sense is that it's the desire for the rediscovery of a kind of mysticism, the direct experience, which I think gets lost in the Christian West after the Reformation. So the traditional term in academic in theology is the apophatic tradition, the negative way, which is that we're pushing.
Speaking.
Yeah, so we're pushing reason to its limits, saying everything that can be said, and then in the moment that you stop speaking, something more direct and beyond reason is experienced. This is in the ancient world as well. It's amongst the skeptics in the ancient Greek world too. So it's not anything new or even particular to Buddhism. But I think that Buddhism provides a way of exploring this kind of mysticism, to use a more Christian term.
The implication of what you've just said, Mark, is that you would have been happy staying a Christian priest if it had been before about the year 1400.
I think that in this country we lose a lot when at the time of the Reformation and the dissolution of the monasteries, it's like suddenly in a generation these immensely rich contemplative traditions that hold both a particular kind of rational theology but also this rich resource for exploring the inner world just gets ripped out.
I think it's probably okay to be perhaps a Christian after the 1970s, 80s, when some Christian groups were... Yes, I'll allow it, because they're starting to get a sense that Buddhism is sort of outrunning them. One guy told a story, a monastic told a story of having young guy turn up his monastery, and he thought he wanted to come in. He just wanted to know where the Buddhist retreat was down the road. And people like him started to rediscover the contemplative experiential dimension in Christianity, partly prompted, I think, by the popularity of Buddhism and people searching for that kind of experience. So it's had quite an impact.
Well, can I use that to do a last set of questions that I'd like you to consider about where this is going? Because, look, if we talk about Christianity, we can talk about Protestant evangelicals in the United States. We can talk about the Catholic Church in Latin America. Islam, of course, always in the news, Shia, Sunni, Islamism, and, what's real Islam and what isn't. Can we talk about the global influence of Buddhism today in those terms, Chris?
I think so. I think maybe you asked a question about what postmodern Buddhism might be like, and I think there are two very brief things. One is that more and more the health benefits are being understood, with difficulties, like we've said, about ethics possibly and how it's really used. The other one, I think, is an understanding that we're not, as it were, brains on legs. We need to have an embodied sense of our own spirituality. And so actually going back to traditional elements like ritual and liturgy as a much richer form of spiritual experience, I think that's maybe where we're going.
Mark?
I think that we're in the middle of the formation of a kind of Western Buddhism. Stephen Batchelor, one of the important popular writers on Western Buddhism, he tells how when Buddhism went into China and Japan, it took, maybe 2 or 3 centuries for a kind of authentic indigenous Buddhism to form. Buddhism's been on the minds of philosophers in the 19th century like Nietzsche and Schopenhauer, so we're maybe like 150 years into that process in the West. So we've got another 150 years
and Hermann
or so to
Hesse
go.
after that, of course, with Siddhartha as well, very much as part of that. Annabeth, how about you? I mean, you obviously work in sociology of religion as well. Do you see Buddhism as an equivalent force to these other world religions?
Well, I mean, you're just talking about sort of worldwide in a sense. And I think somebody like Daisaku Ikeda, who is the president of the Soka and he certainly...
Just explain again briefly, what is the Soka Gakkai?
The Soka means Value Creating Society, and it's Soka International. So it exists. It's based on Nichiren Buddhism and very much rooted in the doctrines of Nichiren. And and it's very much a sort of practice of, like mindfulness, but certainly internal transformation that takes place and sort of elevation of life state in that sense. And so there's a different perspective of engagement and trying to create value, which is the name of the organisation, in interaction, in social engagement. So it's very much a socially engaged kind of Buddhism. So in that sense, Daisaku Ikeda, for instance, on a sort of more national or international level, rather, in terms of together with the United Nations, have various different initiatives.
A good example. And Rupert, finally to you, we had the implication from Mark that maybe after the end of Catholicism, the world should have turned to Buddhism rather than Protestantism. But do you see a sort of global role for Buddhism?
Well, I think probably the West had an initial sort of love affair with Buddhism, and maybe we're reaching a more mature understanding of Buddhism, and we're examining more the different facets rather than just the bits that are initially.
And do we like
attractive.
what we see, if we as the West?
We like some aspects, but it's a bit like reading a poet that you love, and then you study the author, and you find out more about the author and the different meanings and intentions, perhaps, and explore the way that poetry has been used. I think there's kind of an analogy there, I think.
Excellent. And on that point, I'm afraid that I have to cast us all now into a state of non-being, as that's all for tonight's programme, which was produced by Luke Mulhall. Many thanks to my guests tonight, Rupert Gethin, Annabeth Fisker-Nielsen, Mark Vernon and Christopher Harding. And if you tuned in to hear the interview with Norman Doidge on New Horizons in Neuroscience, then apologies, we will be running it, but in another programme in the near future. Tomorrow night at 10 p.m, another chance to hear Matthew Sweet in conversation with the novelist David Grossman. This is a download from the BBC. For more information and our terms of use, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio3.